स्टडी IQ IAS, अब तैयारी हुई अफोर्डेबल।
भारत के इतिहास का सबसे बड़ा स्कैम कहा गया।
जब मैं घुसा कमरे में तो मुझे ऐसा लगा जैसे यू वॉक इनटू अ ग्रेवयार्ड। CBI was after officers, after files. My predecessor was sitting behind thick files. Yes, there were irregularities. It would be wrong to say that there were no irregularities. To call it a scam of the scale that it was made, I'm not very sure that was correct. The CAG was working out the cost. It took the average cost of mining. Now, this is the most erroneous thing that he did. I distinctly recall the Deputy CAG flashing the report in a media conference. To my mind, that is not the job of the CAG. The job of the CAG is to submit the report to the parliament. Scam is that everyone was engaged and there was total loot going around. No, it was not so. That the Prime Minister who held the charge of coal said that he was misled. How can this happen? What we've discussed so far was not the coal story. Coal story was something else.
IAS Behind the Scenes एपिसोड 3 में आप सभी का स्वागत है। आज हम कोल स्कैम पर चर्चा करने वाले हैं और उस व्यक्ति से जो खुद देश के कोल सेक्रेटरी थे। क्या कोल स्कैम सही में एक स्कैम था? इंटरेस्टिंग बात है कि CAG की जो पहली ड्राफ्ट रिपोर्ट थी उसमें इस स्कैम की जो वैल्यू थी वो थी 10.7 लाख करोड़। जब फाइनल रिपोर्ट आई देन वैल्यू वाज 1.86 लाख करोड़, यानी कि भारत के इतिहास का सबसे बड़ा स्कैम कहा गया। लेकिन आज जानेंगे क्या वाकई स्कैम था क्या और पर्दे के पीछे से क्या चल रहा था। तो आई वेलकम मिस्टर अनिल स्वरूप। तो वेलकम टू द शो सर। स्टार्ट करेंगे सर इसी पॉइंट से कि सबसे पहले तो फिगर में इतना बड़ा डिफरेंस कैसे?
अब इस फिगर का डिफरेंस के बारे में तो जिसने बनाया वही बताएंगे। मैं आपको बता सकता हूँ ये फिगर क्या था जो फाइनली आप 1.86 करोड़ आप बता रहे हैं। इसका थोड़ा सा मैं पृष्ठभूमि देना चाहूँगा जी, क्योंकि जब मेरी पोस्टिंग हुई एज कोल सेक्रेटरी तो तब ये अखबार में मैं पढ़ रहा था, लेकिन मुझे इतना नहीं पता था कि इतनी भयावह स्थिति है। तो जब मेरी पोस्टिंग हुई तो मैंने अपने मित्र को फ़ोन किया। मैंने उनसे कहा, बॉस ये कोल सेक्टर कैसा है? तो उसने जवाब तो दिया नहीं, उसने मुझे काउंटर क्वेश्चन कर लिया। उसने कहा गैंग्स ऑफ वासेपुर देखी है क्या? तो उससे मुझे समझ में आ गया कि यहाँ समस्या है बहुत। अब मुझे स्मरण है कि फर्स्ट टाइम व्हेन आई वॉक्ड इनटू द रूम ऑफ द कोल सेक्रेटरी, क्योंकि मेरी पोस्टिंग एज OSD हुई थी और समस्या इतनी गंभीर थी कि मेरे प्रीडिसेसर के रिटायर होने के 15 दिन पहले मेरी वहाँ पोस्टिंग कर दी गई थी, जिससे मैं समझ लूँ। और जब मैं घुसा कमरे में तो मुझे ऐसा लगा जैसे यू वॉक इनटू अ ग्रेवयार्ड, बिकॉज CBI was after officers, after files. My predecessor was sitting behind thick files. तो मैंने कहा कहाँ पर, फर्स्ट रिएक्शन था कहाँ फंस गए। बट उसके बाद बड़ा मज़ा आया और मुझे ये टाइम लगा समझने में कि ये है क्या, समस्या क्या है, और मैंने उससे कभी विस्तार से समझा। I was fortunate to have an absolutely amazing team, a wonderful team that helped me understand the entire background of the so-called scam. And I am jumping the gun here. In my view, yes, there were irregularities. It would be wrong to say that there were no irregularities. There were. To call it a scam of the scale that it was made, I'm not very sure that was correct. And that is something which I've brought about in my book, Not Just a Civil Servant, where I have at length tried to explain where did the CAG go wrong. In fact, the title of that chapter is Where Did Vinod Go Wrong in His Rai as CAG.
जी.
And I'm confirmed that I don't think what CAG arrived at were the correct numbers. And let me explain this to you. To the world, it got to be known that the scam ran into more than 1.7 lakh crores, 1.8 lakh crores. But the fact of the matter is that the calculations done by CAG were not correct. And for a layman, I'd like to explain, the calculations were based on understanding what is the cost of mining and what would be the revenue that will come. That is the supply. When it is supplied, the price at which it is supplied. While the CAG was working out the cost, it took the average cost of mining. Now, this is the most erroneous thing that he did. Why? Because the cost of mining varies from 400 rupees tons to 3,000 rupees per ton. Those that understand the sector will realize that underground mining requires a lot more cost because you have to go deep inside and dig it. Whereas in some areas of the country, the coal is very easily available. It is not deep inside the ground, and hence the cost of mining is very little. So what this CAG did was took it an average. In fact, what he should have done was to go to each mine and work out its cost and the revenue that would have been generated and come out with the exact figures. So this was the first fault, that the calculations were incorrect.
Okay.
As I said, I have brought this out in my book, and no one has come back to me pointing out that what I am saying is wrong. Not even the then CAG. Everyone has endorsed what I am saying. So fundamentally, the calculation was wrong. Number two, I think that was a graver mistake, that the CAG went to town with it. I distinctly recall the deputy CAG flashing the report in a media conference. To my mind, that is not the job of the CAG. The job of the CAG is to submit the report to the parliament and let the parliament take a call. If action had to be taken, let the parliament or the PSC take that call. It is not for the CAG to go to town and announce a scam has happened. How can a CAG? He is a civil servant after all. He is a constitutional authority. He should have quietly done his job. The consequence of what he did were devastating. Why? Because when I joined as coal secretary, no civil servant wanted to take a decision. Everyone was apprehensive. They were bona fide mistakes. They were mistakes otherwise. So I was all for the view that if there is a mistake committed, a mala fide mistake, then action should be taken. But to haul up officers for bona fide mistakes, I think we did a damage to governance as a whole.
Got it. सर, आपका एक बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग पॉइंट है कि मैक्सिमाइजेशन ऑफ रेवेन्यू थ्रू मिनरल्स, दैट्स नॉट द ऑब्जेक्टिव ऑफ गवर्नमेंट. सो इस पे थोड़ा आप एनलाइटन करेंगे?
See, that cannot be the only objective of the government. It can be an objective. भाई रेवेन्यू सब जना इंक्रीज करना चाहते हैं, गवर्नमेंट भी करना चाहेगी. Where a particular mineral is an input for some other output, then the government can think in terms of subsidizing this so that the output cost doesn't go up. Take for example electricity. मान लीजिए हमने ऑक्शन कर दिया कोल प्राइस पूरा, तो कोल प्राइस तो हमें मिल जाएगा, लेकिन दैट कोल इज एन इनपुट टू इलेक्ट्रिसिटी जनरेशन, द कॉस्ट ऑफ इलेक्ट्रिसिटी विल गो अप. So if the government has controlled electricity generation and government wants to keep the electricity prices low, then it has to keep the coal price low. And that is the reason why you don't want to maximize revenue on the input. If you maximize the revenue on input, the cost of the output will go up.
Exactly.
Similarly, हम सब फोन इस्तेमाल करते हैं. मान लीजिए हम इस पे 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G पर मैक्सिमम कर दें इनपुट कॉस्ट, तो हमारी आपकी कॉस्ट ऑफ कॉल बढ़ जाएगी ना. अपनी जेब से तो कोई पैसा नहीं देगा.
बिल्कुल.
सो उसमें भी there are occasions where you allocate something so as to keep the output cost. So what you do is you transfer the revenue of the government to subsidize the some output which is an input for another output.
Yes.
So for example, आज अगर आपकी ये टेलीफोन कॉस्ट बढ़ जाए तो आपका जो और यूज करते हैं आप टेलीफोन से वो कम हो जाएगा. So there are number of cases where government consciously keeps the input costs down, not to benefit the private entrepreneur, but to benefit the consumer.
Exactly.
So it is not always maximizing revenue. In some cases, they optimize that.
Exactly.
So as to keep the output cost.
I hope you got the clarity. Maximize, optimize. गवर्नमेंट के पास दो चॉइस हैं. पहला कि वो ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा दाम में एलोकेशन मतलब ऑक्शन कर दे कोल को, ठीक है, हमारे पास रेवेन्यू बहुत ज़्यादा आ गया. दूसरा आपके पास ऑप्शन है कि भाई हम पहले से ही आपको कुछ सस्ते में कोल दे रहे हैं, राइट. अब इल्जाम मत लगाना कि ज्यादा में बिक सकता था, हम पहले से सस्ते में दे रहे हैं जानबूझकर, क्योंकि इस कोल से जब आप इलेक्ट्रिसिटी बनाएं तो कंडीशन इज अटैच्ड कि वो इलेक्ट्रिसिटी सस्ती हो, क्योंकि उसी इलेक्ट्रिसिटी से फैक्ट्रीज चलनी है, आप सबके हमारे घरों में लाइट्स आनी है, इलेक्ट्रिसिटी आनी है. तो कहने का मतलब है इस तरीके से वो सब्सिडी का ट्रांसफर भी होता है. तो जब भी कोई आगे से स्कैम की बात आए तो तुरंत मान नहीं लेनी है. आज के डिस्कशन को दोबारा देख लेना है, किसी से इस पर चर्चा कर लेनी है, इसको शेयर भी कर सकते हैं आप, तो आपको पता लग जाएगा कि हाँ उसकी तह तक जाना ज़रूरी है. सर, यहाँ पर एक चीज़ मैंने पढ़ी कि जो फर्स्ट रिपोर्ट थी उसमें 10.7 लाख का आंकड़ा इस वजह से भी था कि देयर इज अ कॉन्सेप्ट कॉल्ड इन सीटू कोल एंड एक्सट्रैक्टेबल कोल. तो अगर कोई कोल ब्लॉक एलोकेट होता है तो उसमें टोटल एजम्पशन कितना कोल हो सकता है, उसके एस्टिमेट के हिसाब से उन्होंने फर्स्ट रिपोर्ट बताई. लेकिन फिर एक्सट्रैक्टेबल रियल में कितना एक्सट्रैक्ट हो पाएगा वो बहुत कम है, तो वो फिगर 1.86 लाख करोड़ दे दी. जो पार्लियामेंट में रिपोर्ट गई, जो कि फाइनल रिपोर्ट थी, फिर इसके बेसिस पे जब पार्लियामेंट्री कमेटी एसेस कर रही थी तो पता लगा कि 1993 से अगर हम पूरा रिकॉर्ड देखें तो इरेगुलेटरीज रही हैं. तो 1993 से अभी तक इरेगुलेटरीज रही हैं. लेकिन हम आपके थ्रू मतलब जनता तक वो चीज़ पहुंचाना चाहते हैं जिस पर काफ़ी ज़्यादा चर्चा नहीं हुई कि ये इरेगुलरिटी का मतलब क्या है और ये इरेगुलरिटी की बारीकियां क्या हैं. क्योंकि व्हेन आई वाज गोइंग इन दिस डिस्कशन तो पता लगा कि यहाँ पर स्टेट गवर्नमेंट का भी रोल होता है. मीन्स अगर यूनियन कह रहा है कि ऐसा होना चाहिए कि आप यहाँ पर बिडिंग होनी चाहिए, कॉम्पिटिटिव बिडिंग होनी चाहिए। आई थिंक कोर आइडिया वाज दैट कि कॉम्पिटिटिव बिडिंग नहीं आपने कराई और इस वजह से आपने एक स्क्रीनिंग कमेटी के थ्रू आपने 155 कोल ब्लॉक्स को एलोकेट करा दिया, तो गवर्नमेंट ने रेवेन्यू लॉस उसमें लिया है। लेकिन मुद्दा यह है कि अगर स्टेट गवर्नमेंट कहे कि भाई हमारा भी इसमें से है और वी आर नॉट अलाउइंग दैट, तो क्या इसके पीछे क्या?
सी, लेट्स ट्राई एंड अंडरस्टैंड हाउ इट वर्क्स।
जी।
ड्यूरिंग दैट टाइम द प्रोसेस वाज नॉट टू ऑक्शन इट।
ओके।
The government in its wisdom can decide as to what should be the process of allocation.
Okay.
It could be through auction, it could be through allocation. If it is to be allocated or it is to be auctioned, a process has to be defined.
Ji.
What would be the process of allocation? In my understanding, the process of allocation did entail a recommendation from the state government. And in most of the cases, recommendation was indeed taken from the state government.
Exactly.
There was a committee constituted which went into the details before deciding who should be allocated. In some cases, the process as defined was perhaps not followed. That was wrong. It should have been followed. But in other cases, the process was followed. There were cases where people who applied for allocation coal blocks furnished fraudulent documents.
Yes.
So in all such cases, action should be taken. But to say that auction was not done, if auction was the process, auction should have been done. If allocation was the process through allocation of blocks to some entities, then that process should have followed. Government has this wisdom. Let me explain this to you how it works. So, for example, if I auction the coal blocks, then the government is taking the entire revenue coming out of coal. For example, if there is 10 million tons of coal, they will auction that how much would you pay to the government? And the maximum price comes to the government. On the other hand, government can also say that, okay, no one is coming to mine these coals. So, if I auction this, no one will come.
Exactly.
When you start in the late 90s, there were no takers for coal mining because coal mining was not easy.
Yes.
So people used to call, I'll give you a parallel example. When a new industrial area is set up, or new township is set up, schools are given land at 1 rupee because you invite them to. Now 10 years down the line, you can't say that this is the value of the land, you should have charged so much from the. So there are many considerations on the basis of which government takes a decision. We can't have a hindsight and say this was right and this was wrong. However, the process that the government defines, and government means the appropriate authority. In some cases, decision has to be taken by the cabinet.
Okay.
So minister cannot take that decision. So if the minister has taken a decision which he was not authorized, then it's a wrong decision. The rules of business define as to which is the authority to take a decision on that. In some of the cases in coal block auction, the process that was defined and the authority that was to take that decision did not take that decision.
Okay.
So had these decisions that were taken gone to the cabinet, then I don't think there would have been any problem. But in many cases, it did not go to the cabinet. So there were a number of irregularities, as I said. I'm not saying there were no irregularities, but to call it a scam is wrong. Scam is that everyone was engaged and there was total loot going around. No, it was not so. A large number of mines were correctly allocated as per the process. Unfortunately, as a consequence of CGA report, the CAG had suggested mines allocated after 2004 should be, cancelled.
Ji.
But the Supreme Court went up to the 90s.
Yes.
All the mines were cancelled.
Yes.
I don't understand the rationale behind it. So if there was any wrong done in allocation of file of that block, then that should be cancelled. But across the board cancellation doesn't make any sense to me.
सर ने एक क्लियर डिस्टिंक्शन किया एलोकेशन में और ऑक्शन में. सो सर, बिफोर दिस रिपोर्ट क्या हमारे यहाँ पर एलोकेशन ही चल रहा था या ऑक्शन भी?
ऑक्शन नहीं हो रहा था,
ऑक्शन
एलोकेशन हो रहा था,
केवल एलोकेशन.
So what I say is, we can't sit here and say it should be allocated or it should be auctioned.
Okay.
The question is, the government has the right to decide whether it want to allocate or it want to auction.
Okay.
And define a process for allocation, define a process for auction. Now, if the government decides that it has to be auctioned, then obviously you can't allocate outside of it. If it decides to allocate, then you have to follow the process of that allocation. In that also the decision-making authority is defined who will decide as to whether a landmine should go to A, B or C.
Ji.
The question is whether that process was followed. That is one. Second, if that process was not followed, then what is the loss that accrued to the government? So that will be the financial loss. So these two questions had to be answered. So CAG very correctly pointed out that in some cases, the process was not followed. But while determining the loss as a consequence of not following that process, I think the calculations were wrong. That's the point that I'm trying to make here.
Got it, sir. So, what is the exact role of states means in this? मतलब अगर हम लीगल स्टैंड पॉइंट से बात करें तो स्टेट का कितना किस एरिया में क्या इन्फ्लुएंस होता है?
इसमें we must understand this very clearly that though the process of auction or allocation is done by the central government, all revenue goes to the state government. So all royalty goes to the state government. Central government doesn't get a single penny. So it's a very interesting sort of an arrangement.
इसी पॉइंट पे मैं लाना चाह रहा था जिससे कि वो स्कैम एज अ फिगर वो क्लियर हो सके.
The money as a consequence of royalty, not a single penny comes to the central government. Entire royalty goes to the state government. Number one. Number two, in the process that was laid out, as I understood, in the allocation of box, the recommendation of the state government was mandatory. If the state government did not recommend, then the central government could not allocate a mine. So that for that purpose, state recommendation was necessary. And it is correct also. You know, these coal mines exist in state governments. The coal exists in the states. So central government may be assisting or facilitating, but it's the mineral of the state. And that's why they get the revenue. So fundamentally, I think the principles were all right. But as we went along, I think there were, as I said, there were irregularities. There were financial losses, not to the extent as provided by CAG. My personal view was that CAG should have taken care to go into each allocation and determined which was right, which was wrong. And then Supreme Court went a step ahead. They, across the board, cancelled everything. And look at the crisis it created. You know, around 90 millions of tons was being produced by these 204 mines that were cancelled. And they had to stop on 31st of March 2015. So it was a severe crisis. When we were short of coal and you have suddenly 90 million tons also again going out, it's a very serious crisis.
अभी आप लोग सोच रहे होंगे कि फिर सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट इस पॉलिसी में एक मेजर रोल प्ले करती क्यों है? सर इस पे कुछ
That is how it is defined. The allocation system is such that since it is centrally determined as to who would get the block.
Yes.
Coal block or coal mine.
But why? What's the reason?
Because the coal mineral belongs to the central government, so to say. There are certain minerals that are laid down which are controlled by the center. There are other minerals which are controlled by the state government. So coal as a mineral is controlled by, under the law, controlled by these.
But revenue from coal as a mineral will go to the states.
To the state government.
States, yeah. और एक शायद एंगल ये भी हो सकता है कि इस मिनरल को स्पेसिफिकली ऐसा क्यों रखा गया?
Not only this. There are large number of minerals because they are considered to be of national importance.
Yes, national importance.
Because it's a critical input in energy for the country.
Yes.
So hence it is.
Exactly. तो ये पॉइंट बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है कि इंडिया में जो अभी हमारी इलेक्ट्रिसिटी जनरेशन है उसमें ह्यूज डिपेंडेंस हमारी थर्मल पावर पर है. तो ऐसे में कोल एक एसेंशियल इंग्रेडिएंट मान लीजिए आप. तो ऐसे में वो नेशनली डिटरमाइंड पॉलिसी हमारी नेशनल पावर सिक्योरिटी के लिए जरूरी है. सर जब आप कोल सेक्रेटरी बने तो उसके बाद एक चैलेंज तो ये था कि स्टिग्मेटाइज्ड एक पोस्ट है और एक बहुत ईमानदार IAS ऑफिसर जो इस पोस्ट पर थे उन्होंने बहुत ज़्यादा डिफिकल्ट टाइम देखा. तो आप इस पहलू पर कुछ बताना चाहेंगे?
देखिए, इट इज़ वेरी अनफॉर्चुनेट दैट मिस्टर हरीश गुप्ता हैड टू कम टू ग्रीफ इन ऑल दिस. I have had interaction with him before he became coal secretary and I know him. One of the most honest IAS officers that I can really vouch for him. And he got caught in the crossfire because the processes were very complex. There were situations where the applicants had put in wrong papers. And to expect coal secretary to examine those papers, I think it's asking too much of him. So these papers were presented before a committee which he chaired. I mean, the coal secretary himself didn't take a decision. There was a committee chaired by him. There were recommendations from the state government. And very unfortunately, no other committee member was held responsible. And Mr. Harish Gupta was held responsible for a decision which was based on documents which were okay on apparently on the face of record. There was nothing wrong with them. Yet, since wrong documents were submitted to him, that is one. Second, in no case was any mala fide proved. I mean, there's no financial trail to him. But unfortunately was law at that point in time was such, now of course the law has been changed, that if any wrongful benefit has accrued to a private entity, then the civil servant involved, whether he has himself benefited or not, will be held liable That was the law.
Yes.
So since a wrong was done, and since he was the civil servant in the process, unfortunately, he was the only person who was caught. I mean, frankly speaking, he was not to be blamed in most of the cases. And if, for the purpose of argument, we say that he was responsible, then the entire committee was responsible. Then even the minister who signed the file was responsible. It's very unfortunate that the Prime Minister who held the charge of coal said that he was misled. How can this happen? All the documents that were available at the command of Mr. Harish Gupta as Secretary Coal were available to the PM. And anyone who knows how the PMO functions, everything is examined at length. How could it be misleading? If he was misled, so was Mr. Gupta. So there was something fundamentally wrong there. And that is being discovered gradually. Everything is coming to the fore. And that is why probably the current government also came to the conclusion that this needs to be corrected, this law needs to be corrected.
आप सबको क्लैरिफाई कर दें कि उस समय जो मनमोहन सिंह जी, हमारे पूर्व प्रधानमंत्री, वही कोल का पोर्टफोलियो देख रहे थे और अगस्त 2012 में उन्होंने पार्लियामेंट में कहा भी था कि कोल जैसा कोई स्कैम नहीं हुआ है, अगर ऐसा प्रूव हो जाए तो ही विल क्विट पॉलिटिक्स। खैर उसके बाद वो सीवीसी देन सीबीआई ने केस दर्ज किया, चार्जशीट फाइल हुई, फिर वो प्रोसेस चलता रहा, आईटी भी फिर उसके बाद उसमें एक्टिव हो गया। सर, एक जनरल परसेप्शन ये है कि अगर उसी समय की गवर्नमेंट पर कोई अपोजिशन पार्टी कोई ब्लेम लगाती है स्कैम का, तो उस समय की सीएजी, सीबीआई, वो परसेप्शन है कि वो जनरली सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट के अपोज में नहीं जाएगी। एक परसेप्शन है, मतलब परसेप्शंस, जस्ट परसेप्शन। तो परसेप्शंस का भी अपना एक स्कैम होता है बाय द वे, और जिससे हमारी कंट्री काफ़ी समय पर ग्रस्त होती रहती है। उसके लिए इंटेलेक्चुअल ऐसी कन्वर्सेशन ज़रूरत होती है। अनिल स्वरूप सर की ज़रूरत होती है कि वो लाइट इस पे डालें। तो सर, इस पे आपकी क्या ओपिनियन है? मतलब क्योंकि आपने एक वर्ड यूज़ किया क्रॉस फायर, तो क्रॉस फायर का मतलब देयर आर टू साइड्स।
देखिए, ऐसा है कि द होल इशू वाज पॉलिटिसाइज्ड
जी,
and that is the crossfire. It is in the political crossfire that some civil servants got caught. Right? So, as you say, the job of CAG is to be totally apolitical. Now, it would be wrong of me to attribute politics to the then CAG. I mean, some people do say that, but I have no evidence for that. To me, he just went overboard. He just got too excited with what he thought was right, and most of it was incorrect. So he got overboard, and probably he thought he should get into the limelight, which he did. And in doing that, he did enormous amount of damage to governance. I think more than the financial part, if there was any, I think the damage to governance was absolutely enormous, because I suffered. As coal secretary, initially, there weren't very many officers prepared to commit themselves on the file. In some of the cases, when we did our own coal block auctions, I used to initiate the recommendation as Secretary Government of India. I don't think there is a precedence to it. Because I did not push my joint secretaries to recommend anything. If they felt uncomfortable, they didn't. So the primary recommendation came from me, and the minister approved it.
Okay. Recommendation for allocation?
See, when you do auction, then you pick up that this is the lowest bid or whatever is the criteria, and then you recommend he should be allocated by. So that's the recommendation that someone has to give. Usually, in such a situation, it will come from a director or somebody will write, we did this auction and he's the lowest bidder and it should be given. In a number of cases, they did it. In some cases, I had to initiate that. And I can't blame the civil servants, because everyone was of the view that even for a bona fide mistake, you could be hauled up. And mistakes are natural in a complex thing. I must confess to you that we also committed mistakes. And it was a lesson for me. So what I used to do was, we made the whole office totally transparent.
Yes.
Coal Ministry, one of the very few ministries where we didn't have files or papers. We had dispensed with it. All auctions were visible to the public at large. They were done in public domain. You could see the bids going up. So when auction was being done. So because of transparency, when we took this decision that so-and-so would get this mine, the decision was immediately displayed on our web portal. And in one case, I distinctly remember, we took a wrong decision. Suddenly, I started getting calls that this allocation is incorrect. So I got the office opened in the night. We corrected the decision. In the morning, we called a press conference and announced that we committed this mistake. So it was a lesson for me, because I keep telling my colleague officers also that if you use technology and make things transparent, then no one can attribute motives to you, because you're open.
Exactly.
So one reason why things happened earlier were because the whole process was opaque. It was not transparent. Today, technology allows you to be totally transparent, and that helped.
सर ने जो आपको इंसाइट्स दी वो क्लियर कट आपकी एथिक्स के स्टडी से कनेक्ट करती है कि आप डिजिटलाइजेशन से, टेक्नोलॉजी से ओपन हो सकते हैं। अगर ओपन है तो अगर मिस्टेक हो भी गई तो आप ओपनली डिक्लेयर कर सकते हैं। तो इंटेंशन करने का इंटेंशन तो क्लियर ही होगी ना फिर, तभी तो आपने टेक्नोलॉजी को इन्फ्यूज किया उस पूरे प्रोसेस में। सो ओवरऑल सर, बीइंग अ कोल सेक्रेटरी, नंबर वन, व्हाट यू डिड, यू एक्चुअली ओवरहोल्ड द होल प्रोसेस, यू ब्रॉट दिस ट्रांसपेरेंसी, राइट? What are the kind of challenges which our coal sector is facing right now?
So before you come to that, I think what we've discussed so far was not the coal story. Coal story was something else.
Oh.
You know, if you look at the cause of the scam, or so-called scam, was the shortage of coal. If there were no shortage of coal, why should people run around for coal blocks? So this is what I understood in the initial couple of months. And then my entire focus was not on auction, was on increasing coal production. That is the coal story. And that is why the moment we started increasing production to record levels, in fact, 14-15 we increased by 34 million tons, which was more than the cumulative increase before 4 years. And next year, another 44 million tons. So from acute shortage of coal, in 2016, we were toying with the idea of exporting coal to Bangladesh. So there was no maramari for coal blocks then. In fact, I distinctly remember after the initial 2 rounds of coal block auction, in the 3rd round of coal block auction, there weren't any takers because everyone was comfortable. Coal India was producing sufficient coal to meet the demands of the country. Initially, in the first 2 coal block auctions, there was a lot of maramari because people didn't know whether coal will come, so they wanted to grab at any price. In fact, there was a lot of inflated auction price. Many companies ran into problems because they bid much higher than what was required. And that was on account of the fact that they thought they were not sure whether coal will become available. The moment coal production increased in 2015 and 16, the demand for coal blocks came down. And we were wondering what's happening in the 3rd and the 4th round of coal block auction. They weren't takers. And in first and 2 rounds, very high bid, which clearly indicated that the problem was not scams. Scams or whatever irregularities were a symptom of the shortage of coal. If you improve the shortage of coal, then things would change. So this is the real coal story, increase in coal production.
So exactly आपने वो कैसे किया? Means
वो बड़ा उसका भी थोड़ा मैं आपको बताना चाहूँगा. You know, by which I had put in about 34 years of service as a civil servant. I had come to understand very clearly, in order to find a solution to any problem, you must understand the why of that problem and go deep into it, not scratch the surface. And the tragedy in India was that we were sitting on 300 billion tons of coal. Our requirement was only 800 million tons per annum. Yet we were importing coal and there was coal crisis. So there was demand, there was supplies. Now next question was, if there is supply, then why isn't coal being produced? We go on to the next level. Because for coal production, you require land. And land acquisition is a very tough thing. Secondly, all this coal existed in areas which are forested. So you required forest and environment clearance. Then, since they were in inaccessible area, you require railway lines and railway carriages to carry out the coal. So these were the 3 primary problems. We addressed these 3 issues.
Okay.
And for this, people ask me, give me one action that you took that sorted this out. And that one action is, I didn't convene a single meeting as coal secretary in Delhi. I used to go to the state governments, sit with them, sit with local officers, and convey a value proposition to the state governments that all the revenue is going to come to you.
Exactly.
So come and cooperate. They cooperated. And that is how the coal production increased. We actually acquired more than 5,000 hectares of land in 14-15 and 15-16, and got environment clearance for 3,000 hectares of land, more than that. So that being so, land became available. Environment forest clearance, we got it through a system that I put in place, a transparent system of faster clearances. Engaged with railways, got the railway racks, record number of railway racks. Consequent to which production increased, supply increased. And the situation was such that when I joined as coal secretary, there were about more than 25 plants, power plants, which were in a crisis. In 2016, not a single power plant was in crisis. They had sufficient coal to run those plants. So this actually is the coal story, the increase in coal production, not coal block auctions, because we auctioned the coal blocks, productions increased much later. The real job was done by Coal India Limited actually.
I hope आपने जो लास्ट में सर ने अभी शेयर किया कि how he actually turned around the whole picture and what the real coal story is. That's the power of a civil servant behind the scenes. Thanks for coming to the show, sir.
Thank you very much.
Study IQ IAS. अब तैयारी हुई अफोर्डेबल.